Now that's the panel, and I have some very eminent speakers out here, who would be sharing their views with us. But let me, set a framework for this afternoon's discussion. As we all know, we live in turbulent and unpredictable times. So we are looking at how will the Indian Ocean countries navigate through complex geopolitics at work, be it where climate uncertainties are concerned, be it radicalization or terrorism, or peace and security issues, or the emerging new technologies. How do we deal with them? So that's something that we need to move through and find base for looking at the framework of coming together, building consensus, a culture of confluence, a culture of collaboration and cooperation, building multilateral, bilateral, trilateral frameworks, perhaps the centers, institutions, fusion centers, associations can come together to find innovative solutions for problems that seem to be raging, or to find solutions through discussion and debate for the Indian Ocean region. I must thank the Foreign Affairs Australia for hosting this and to take up the issues of Indian Ocean. I must say here, since we are looking at how do we discuss and debate, find solutions, I must also appreciate and thank India Foundation for actually creating a base for debate and discussion to begin with on Indian Ocean countries. I think this is the first association that took up the challenge, and we've been having series of conferences. Last time in Dhaka, we could, and Australia came forward, and we're doing amazingly well since this morning. Tremendous discussion on how do we find solutions for problems. Some of the things that I wanted to share here before I invite my panelists, let me share the plan. I will invite them in the order that has been given to us, and they will share their views on various emerging technologies or the work they have done and how it can help build the Indian Ocean region, as well as looking at the geopolitics of the world and where would it lead us. So what I thought was, if we look at the spectrum of Indian Ocean, in 2018, our Prime Minister Modi, in his Shangri-La address, actually put down 4 priorities for Indo-Pacific. And the first one is deals with the session that we have this afternoon. And that's the importance of building partnerships, importance of or benefits of collaboration, active engagement with partner countries, 33 Indian Ocean countries, and the littoral, and how do we find a base? How do we build good foreign policies which can lend and support each other, build on security and peace, the outreach that comes with it. The second thing that he said was how do we as Indian Ocean countries learn to distance from any kind of grouping, or he called it alliance of containment. Now, India positioned itself on this right at the top and has been trying to stabilize all through any hostile environment that may be there through cooperation and innovative solutions. So we have different fusion centers that are coming up, associations that are there, research centers that have been working to find solutions. And we have had different set of associations. IORA was built up, then you had Quad, then we had Indo-Pacific Economic Framework that was created out of Quad, and the Sagar, the security and growth for all in the region. I think that is the central idea, growth for all regional countries, and that's regional regions that we have in Indian Ocean. With these few words, let me invite now, to begin with, I will invite David Santoro. He is the CEO and the president of Pacific Forum, USA. He specializes in strategic deterrence, arms control, and non-proliferation. He's been an author of treating weapons proliferation. And he also believed that, the destiny of world lies in finding solutions, solutions to come together to solve all the problems. May I invite David Santoro to begin with? You may take 10 minutes or 15 minutes. We'll have them making a presentation or talking about it the next 10 minutes or 15 minutes, and then we will open it up. Once we complete all the discussions, we will have Q&A.
Thank you very much for this kind introduction. Aloha, everyone. I have to say that being based in Honolulu, I spent 5 years in Australia, so I have a deep connection with Australia as well. But I have to say aloha being based in Honolulu. Thanks very much for this kind introduction. So as was said, my name is David Santoro. I run the Pacific Forum, which is a US think tank based in Honolulu, Hawaii. I have two passports. I've got a US and a French passport. And so if you're wondering where the accent is from, then here's the answer. But I'll be putting on my US hat today, and I'll be trying to address the question that was posed to us in this panel and look at it from a US perspective. And what I'll do is I'll make 3 points that I'll flesh out. I'm not sure I'm going to talk for 10 minutes. I'll be a little quicker because I think the benefit of this is to engage in discussion. So I'll make 3 points that I'll each flesh out a little bit, and then I think we can engage in a discussion. So point number 1 is that I think that to build strong partnerships and a resilient region, the US should begin by reconceptualizing the Indian Ocean. As I'm sure you know, the US has shown an interest in the Indian Ocean, if only by embracing the term Indo-Pacific as opposed to Asia-Pacific, and by renaming the US Pacific Command the US Indo-Pacific Command. And several officials have made clear that they want the US to engage a lot more in the Indian Ocean. But I'm sure you also know that US strategy documents don't have a lot to say about the Indian Ocean. And the US bureaucratic structure is not well adapted to engage the Indian Ocean. Just for instance, the State Department views the Indian Ocean through 4 different bureaus. So you have the African Affairs Bureau, East Asian and Pacific Affairs Bureau, the Near Eastern Affairs Bureau, and the South and Central Asian Affairs Bureau. The US Department of Defense addresses the Indian Ocean through 3 different combatant commands: Indo-PACOM, CENTCOM, and AFRICOM. And that makes it very difficult for the United States to appreciate and manage regional developments. Of these 3 commands, Indo-PACOM has the biggest naval resources and capacity to grasp and respond to maritime developments. But its area of responsibility stops at India, and so a major area of the region is not covered. And so, indeed, to the US, the Indo-Pacific does not include the Western Indian Ocean, and that makes it hard to have a comprehensive picture for the United States and to approach the region effectively. And so that's my first point, that to build strong partnerships, the United States should first reconceptualize the Indian Ocean region. Point number two, I think the US should ramp up engagement of regional countries and do so by focusing on non-traditional security threats. Now, as you all know, much of US foreign policy is focused on competition with China. But from my perspective, it would not be productive for the US to engage the region with an eye to countering China. Or at least that shouldn't be the driving force behind engagement of the region. And that's because regional states have different views of China, different views of the US, and also because there is a deep tradition of non-alignment in the region. So the US should, in my view, instead approach the region as a committed partner and as a problem solver. And even though there are different regional countries have different goals and priorities, by and large, it means focusing on responding to non-traditional security threats. And that means providing solutions and helping build capacity to respond to illicit trafficking, natural disasters, IUU fishing, the list goes on. Climate change is another one. And I think this is important. By helping build partner capacity for instance, fighting maritime crime, that can also be useful for other purposes. And so we can think about multiple payoffs as we engage from a US perspective. And so that's my second point. The US should engage the region and do so by focusing primarily on non-traditional security threats. Point number three, I think the US should act essentially as a support to regional leaders. Now, clearly the US is a global power. It has important assets in the region, but it would not make sense for the US to try and seek leadership in the Indian Ocean for the reasons that I've mentioned before, and also because the US focus, in my sense, should be on the Pacific, not the Indian Ocean. And so even as it ramps up cooperation and engagement of the Indian Ocean, the US should essentially do so by acting as a support of regional leaders. The US and India want to strengthen the US-India relationship, and we've seen a lot of progress over the past year. I think this is really good, and I think one way to strengthen that even further would be for the United States to work with India and think about the best way to divide labor to engage the region, and with India leading the way, and again, the US acting in support. Now, of course, there are many other partners that the United States should work with. Australia is one, France is another. They play important roles. Engagement of the region through the Quad, which means working with India, Australia, and Japan, is also, in my view, a promising approach for the US. And so the bottom line, and this is my third and final point, is that the US would be best served by supporting regional leaders, not by pursuing US leadership in the region. And to be very clear, right now there is no sign that Washington wants to lead in the Indian Ocean anyway, but I think it's very important to be clear about what its role should be. And so again, and really to conclude, in my view, if the US wants to build strong partnerships and build a resilient region, it should, number one, reconceptualize the region. Number two, ramp up engagement of the region with a focus on non-traditional security threats. And then number three, act essentially as a support to existing leadership efforts. And with that, I'll stop here. Thank you.
Hello. Thank you, David, for those very brief but succinct points. 3 solutions. How should US look at Indian Ocean? Reconceptualize, support the leaders of the region. I think that's very well put, because I think we'll take this discussion forward as we go by, and we may want you to give us more inputs on how do you see this reconceptualization, how will it translate into reality? What are some of the things that need to be done for US to take a lead in this? Because with the shifting of powers, we are talking about how we need to open up, and I think we need to pause it on that a little later, but let me now invite my second speaker, and that's Professor Rory Metcalfe, Head of National Security, College Australian National University. Professor Metcalfe has led the expansion of the college into policy engagement. He is known to have worked on future analysis, and this is an institution which for Australia has been a go-to institution where security policy landscape is concerned. Professor Metcalfe, we would be interested in knowing what would you suggest for building resilient partnerships in the region? Yeah, Professor Metcalfe.
Look, thank you very much, Chair, and it's a great pleasure to be here, to be in Australia's Indian Ocean capital and indeed our Indo-Pacific city. Look, I like the way we've commenced this conversation. I want to take it forward and really focus on that theme of building partnerships for a resilient region. And I think we've been posed a question about how do countries collaborate in the region's sustainable development. And of course, there are so many deep meanings and hooks in each of those words. So I'm going to unpack a little bit of that. Even hearing the beginning of the conference today, I'm actually reminded that it's through conferences like this and engagements and gatherings like this that we actually build some sense of shared Indian Ocean regional consciousness, because I'm not even sure that a lot of societies, a lot of countries in the region have traditionally had that sense of the region as a whole, or of the region's connectivity to the broader Indo-Pacific and the world. So when we start the conversation about sustainable development for the region and ensuring, of course, stability and peace and the foundations for prosperity into this century, we actually have to begin with the question of who is collaborating here, which countries, and it's not, of course, only nation states that are going to be the actors in really fulfilling the aspirations of the people of the Indian Ocean. It's also going to involve roles for communities at a local level, roles for the private sector, and roles for international institutions and civil society. Secondly, we have to think a little, and I won't give you all the answers, but we will come back to this question of whose job is it, if you like, to build these networks and provide this sustainable development. Secondly, we need to think about the scale of the problem, the scale now and with a very future focus. And I was doing a little bit of quick sort of research earlier to think about, for example, population growth in the region and where it's concentrated. The point was made in another session this morning, looking particularly at the blue economy, that in fact so much of the, if you like, and not only blue economy but also the impacts of climate change, so much of the impact of climate change and other environmental shock is going to be felt around the Indian Ocean littoral. So much of the population growth of the world in the 21st century, I think as the Minister said this morning, is going to be around the Indian Ocean littoral. So the scale of the challenge is going to be too much for any particular country or combination of countries alone. I mean, even if we take India out of the picture and obviously the economic and human and civilisational scale of India on the region, we look at we look at the African coast of the Indo-Pacific. We go to 2050 and we see whether it's Kenya or Tanzania, Mozambique, South Africa. We can even look at Madagascar itself. All countries with very substantial and growing and young populations. And then we go, of course, to the Asian side of the Indian Ocean and look at Bangladesh and look at Indonesia. We'll have billions of people with aspirations for higher standards of living, for aspirations for environmentally sustainable economic growth. in a region that is going to be geopolitically significant as well. We haven't probably talked a lot today about the geopolitical centrality of the Indian Ocean. Why, for example, is China showing so much interest in the Indian Ocean? Why are global powers stakeholders in the Indian Ocean, even if they're not resident powers? All of that points to a problem of vast scale with a lot of potential for international cooperation to meet those aspirations, but also with a lot of potential for failure, breakdown, even catastrophe. So that's just a gentle starting point to the conversation. I want to talk a little bit now about some of the principles that we need to identify going forward, because it's very easy, not easy, it's actually hard work, but it's very clear to identify particular instances of development needs or education needs or health needs of particular countries. But to look in aggregate at the Indian Ocean as a region, I think we need to be thinking about the principles that will underlie cooperation for regional development. And I've got a couple of guideposts when I think about those principles. In fact, one of the guideposts is not from the Indian Ocean, and I would recommend our Indian Ocean friends to also think about the Pacific, because at least as a statement of intent, the strategic document of the Pacific Islands Forum, the 2050 vision for the blue Pacific continent, actually provides, I think, a really useful measure, a really useful benchmark for what we should be thinking about in the Indian Ocean as well. That's a document that looks collectively at the needs of the region. Of course, a region with a much smaller population, but an equally enormous, if you like, vast resource and oceanic area to protect. And it looks quite holistically at the development needs of that community, towards the middle of this century. And so it defines development not only in terms of GDP growth or terms of economic growth, but it also looks, for example, at governance, it looks at education, looks obviously at health, and it looks at security in the broadest sense. And I think that document, although it's clearly in a very early stage of implementation, provides a measure for, I think, ambitions to build, if not pan-Indian Ocean ambitions, whether it's through IORA or other means, but at least to build ambitions for collections of Indian Ocean countries to identify common interests for their populations. The other document that I'm going to mention, which takes us back a few years now, is the way in which the government of India responded to the Belt and Road Initiative back in 2017. And I found that response to the promise and the enticements of the Belt and Road Initiative to be, to this day, an incredibly useful measure of the kinds of qualities we would like to see in sustainable development. Now, this is not to say, of course, that India or any other country in the region has itself fulfilled all of those promises over the years. I think it's a benchmark that's tough for any country, including Australia. But the sense of direction in that document, which set out the principles for sustainable development projects in the region, was absolutely right. So I think whenever we look at the needs of the Indian Ocean region, we need to be thinking, for example, about sensitivity to the the wishes and the development needs of local communities. We need to be thinking about transparency. We need to be thinking about accountability. We need to be thinking about, obviously, the commercial viability of loans, but also the sustainability of development projects. And we need to be thinking about the role of education. So I guess if we're looking for a few benchmark documents, we don't need to look necessarily at documents that have already been generated collectively by the Indian Ocean. We can be a little bit more creative and look at other parts of the world or look at particular countries that have at least stated ambitions to aim for. I'm going to conclude with a couple of thoughts about what we can do, and I'm going to talk a little bit about an Australian perspective. And Chair, please, if I take too long, you're going to send me a signal that it's time to give up the floor. But from an Australian perspective, I think we have an acute sense that although we are an Indian Ocean power and we're an Indo-Pacific power, we have finite capabilities, we have finite resources. We're not going to make a fundamental difference to the security and the development of this region on our own. And I think any country that thinks they have that capacity is going to have to think again. But one of our strengths in this country is an ability to build partnerships, is a convening capacity, and I think there's a demonstration of that here today with our friends from India as well. And so when Australia looks at the Indian Ocean, we need to be looking at where can we make a substantial difference as a partner with limited means and effectively as a multiplier or amplifier of the talent that actually exists in the region. So we've heard a little bit of talk today already of the role of education, and I would like to reinforce that. When Australia looks out onto the Indian Ocean, it's a big place, as my friend and colleague Gordon was pointing out, I think, earlier today, and it's not realistic for Australia to be able to devote, I think, quite the same level of resourcing to the Indian Ocean, to our western front, as we do, for example, to the Pacific, where we consider ourselves to have a special set of expectations, or even to our relations with Southeast Asia. But we can do more than we are doing. And so the two ways that I would wrap up on that point to suggest ways forward are, firstly, to think more holistically about the Indian Ocean in a separate conversation with a number of colleagues. Yesterday, Australian colleagues at a roundtable that my college convened here in Perth, we looked, those of us on the academic side of the table at least, looked at the question of whether it makes sense, and I think it doesn't make sense for Australia to somehow arbitrarily say that the Eastern Indian Ocean matters to us and the Western Indian Ocean doesn't matter so much to us. Of course, when you're looking, for example, at military security, at the role of our Navy, we're going to have a much greater effect in terms of deterrence and patrolling closer to Australian territory. That makes perfect sense. But in terms of development assistance or education or being a partner in, if you like, mapping and understanding the regional commons, we can have an impact across the broader region if we build the right coalitions of countries to work with. And then finally on that point, who are those coalitions? I think that inclusive regional institutions, of course, need to be supported, strengthened wherever possible. We know, those of us who've worked in the IORA context, those of us who've worked in the ASEAN Plus context in East Asia or the Indo-Pacific, we know also that these often need to be bolstered by smaller coalitions where there's capability, there's will, there's a readiness to act. The Quad is one of those, but the Indian Ocean is a region with global stakeholders where in fact there's lots of scope to work with smaller groups, just as long as those smaller groups can also plug into, support, inform the regional multilateral processes. So we've talked a little earlier today about the Australia-India-France trilateral, which holds still, I think, considerable promise, but there are other partners as well, some in the Indian Ocean, some like Japan or the Republic of Korea with deep stakes in the region, but perhaps looking for guidance on how best to engage. I will stop there. I hope I've given you a little bit of food for thought, and thank you again for the opportunity to speak today.
Thank you, Professor Metcalf. Now, it's so interesting to hear you, Professor Metcalf. You were talking about the aspirations of the regional cooperation and what could be Australia's role in creating pathways and what does it mean for Australia to be part of the region. I think that's very well put, and maybe as we move forward during the discussions, you could further probably elaborate on that. Now, let me now invite the third speaker, that's Darshana Barua, Fellow Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, US. Now, Darshana has written extensively as a researcher on Indian Ocean. Anybody who would like to dip into the literature on Indian Ocean, I think Darshana is the person. She's been very active, and there are a number of articles that I personally have been going through. A young scholar who has done very well for herself. She is also a visiting fellow at Sasakawa Peace Institution in Tokyo, working on significance of strategic islands in Indian Ocean region. Darshana, can we have a few words? Maybe you should share with us as to what could be the strategic way forward for partnerships. How do we create partnerships? And how do we create sustainable fora for the Indian Ocean region?
Thank you so much. Let me begin by thanking the Australian Department of Foreign Affairs and Trade and the Ministry of External Affairs India for supporting this forum, Perth US Asia Center for providing the platform and bringing us all together with support from India Foundation, of course, and Chair for moderating this. It's really wonderful to be back in Perth. I have been to Australia more than I've been to any other country in the world, I think. But the first city that I've ever been in Australia was Perth, so it's wonderful to be back here. I'm an Indian citizen, but I've had the opportunity to live and work in, of course, Delhi, but also in Tokyo. I spent some months in Canberra with Professor Metcalf, actually back in 2016, and now I live in Washington, D.C. So I've had the opportunity to look at the Indian Ocean through different maritime giants, I would say, and how these capitals think about it. But in my remarks today, I thought I would offer some thoughts in terms of how it is viewed in the region and share with you the conversation on partnership and a resilient region from the point of view of Indian Ocean and not from the lens of any one or two nations. But I'm very happy to provide and go into any of the countries that you might have an interest in discussing during the Q&A session. In the theme for the panel today, the two questions that sort of struck out was, how do you build partnerships which are sustainable, and how do you build a resilient region? And I think it covers a range of issues, and many of that has been touched upon, not just in the panels and by the speakers before me, but also during the opening remarks, as well as the other panels in the morning. In terms of partnerships, how do we build strong partnerships in a region that has such a diverse set of nations with so many varied points of interest? Indian Ocean in itself is huge. It's a point that has been repeatedly made, and I think it's a point that should be made to understand that the only way Indian Ocean can be secured is through partnerships, because it's too big for any one nation to take the lead or the responsibility to secure it and stabilize it. So I think partnerships will have to be at the core of it. But when we come to partnerships, how do we manage interests, right? Because every nation is going to have specific interests in specific geographies of it. It could be in the African coast, it could be in the northeastern Indian Ocean, it could be in the southwest Indian Ocean. So how do we manage that? And I think regardless of the geographic relevance or the subregions of the Indian Ocean region, the thing that would be common for everyone with a coastline in the Indian Ocean would be the issues in the maritime domain. So issues of climate, issues of illegal fishing, issues of transnational crimes, those will all be points of common interest for anybody sitting anywhere across the Indian Ocean region. So I would say the only way perhaps to build partnerships would be to focus on issue-based coalitions, issue-based partnerships. If you already agree this is an issue, I think that is your building block into how best that can be addressed. So I think instead of trying to figure out a common, coherent roadmap for that all the 33 nations agree on the Indian Ocean, perhaps there is some merit in figuring out who agrees on which part of the issues, where the priorities lie. And an issue-based partnership, I think, would also help manage new and emerging interest in the Indian Ocean region, which is also varied. I do want to make a note on interest in this. Every nation is going to have a very different set of perceptions and perspectives on how they define their interest. And it's really going to be important to understand, accept, and I think build into regional and national policies that everyone's interest in the Indian Ocean is going to be different, and not only just the interest is going to be different, that everyone's definition of security is going to be different. Security for country A is not going to be exactly the same for security for someone else. For someone, security could mean hard security. For someone else, security could mean completely climate related. So if you actually speak to a range of defense ministers across the Indian Ocean region, you'll see how each of them define security, and it will reflect the geographic reality of the country that they sit in. And I think it is going to be important as we work towards a coherent and comprehensive Indian Ocean to take into account the difference of how we are framing security. Nobody's concern for security trumps the other ones. So I think a balanced approach to that is going to be key. The second is how a resilient region. How do we create a resilient region that works towards sustainable development? And I think sustainable development and resilience has meaning for different teams around it. Of course, there could be climate resilience and sort of partnerships, but also as the resilience of a regional structure. If IORA, IOC, Indian Ocean Tuna Commissions are the structures that serving the majority of the interests of the Indian Ocean countries, how do we build a resilient region? And I think at the bottom, at the core of this building a resilient region has to be international law and norms. The UNCLOS, the UN Convention on the Law of the Sea, I think holding partners, every nation in the region should be holding partners accountable for their behavior at seas and oceans, and to see our nations upholding the laws and norms and practicing them. The strength is in international law, as difficult as it may be to impose it, because it's only international law that gives an equal voice to everybody across the globe, regardless of the size of the country. So I think if you're really articulating, if nations are articulating themselves that they want to be a maritime power, they want to be a maritime partner, are they really engaging in behavior that is the kind of behavior we want to see in the Indian Ocean region? Are they walking the talk? And I think in building that resilient region, the common principles and framework perhaps would have to be accepted norms, and law is interpreted differently, but I think the oceans have been global commons for such a long time that there have been very much accepted and established acceptable norms in that. I want to end on sort of a thought on global commons and recent development, which we haven't talked about much here. It's the developments across the Red Sea that we have seen happen. And again, I think the division of the Indian Ocean into east versus west, sometimes we tend to forget that you can't draw lines across water. So if something happens on the eastern side, it's going to have an impact on the western side. It's going to have an impact on the eastern side. So just taking an example of something that has been so recent, the Red Sea crisis, the responsibility might come to the sub-region of the Gulf and say the Northern Africa, but then the security of that region is very much important for every nation transiting the Indian Ocean, but also for Southeast Asia. So you might not hear much of Southeast Asia, but Korea, Japan, China, Singapore, everyone's equally dependent on the safety of the Gulf region. So I think when we look back in terms of, again, going back to there might be countries who are articulating that they want to be maritime powers. How many countries have the political will to actually go out there and provide that security irrespective of the flags that the vessels are flying? There are very few countries that might have the political will to do it. Of course, everyone's going to have different capacities. Not everybody is going to have the capacity to be able to deploy to that part, but are countries who are saying that they want to be a serious maritime partner using their capacities, using their technical advantages, using their knowledge to secure and provide and advance global commons across the Indian Ocean region. And I think if we did a mapping of that, of behaviors of actors and states across as maritime players, it will be a pretty clear picture and will help us identify the gaps and the challenges in there. So I'll stop there as some opening remarks and thoughts and look forward to the conversation. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Darshana. I think you were so clear in stating as to how do we partner when the region itself is so diverse, How do we find common interests? How do we deal with challenges? So you also spoke about the political will and the need for international law, which is easier said than done, and that's the reason why we have Indian Ocean Conference, where we all can come together and try to find pathways to build for future. That was a very lucid presentation that you made. Now let me come to the fourth speaker, and we have Dr. Raukaya Casanelli from University of Mauritius, Associate Professor of Media and Political Systems. She is a democracy scholar. She's chair of Electoral Institute for Sustainable Development in Africa. Yeah, yeah. May I, yeah? You can, would you want to speak from here or? Yeah, yeah.
Thank you very much. It's my first Indian Ocean conference, and I'm very excited to be here. As the chair said, I'm a democracy scholar and rather recent to Indian Ocean studies and to the Indian Ocean region, but it's a fascinating region because I think there is a lot of transformation. It's a contested area, it is a competitive area, it is a very much sought after, and I'm going to take it from the perspective of the small islands because, as you yourself said, it's very diverse and there is so many differences from the small countries to the big countries to the island states, etc. But when I was looking and trying to understand the question that was posed here, I mean, resilient regions, collaborative and sustainable development, extremely important ideas, but also very complex. And here today we sit really on the crux of matters that we see enormous changes in our region. I think global climate change has taken, especially the small island states, by storm. So very often now we are in the midst of, wanting to move from rhetorics, bringing into actions and relating it to solutions. So as I said, I'm relatively new to the Indian Ocean studies, and I'm looking at it more at the level of placemaking, because I think the Indian Ocean is an interesting site for placemaking, and I think it borrows itself from human geography. And when you're looking at the place, how is the transformation of place? Who are the actors within the space, within that space? What is the ability for agency, but not only individual agency, but collective agency. And I think this comes to the idea of partnerships, of collaboration, that is so central to bringing about that transformational change. Engagement, but more specifically from small islands, because very often, small islands use this sort of understanding, we are small, we are vulnerable, and this, just before the conversation on stage, we were talking about victimhood of certain islands and certain countries. But I think the idea here today is how can collectivism come together to unlock partnership? But a little bit of context and background and evolution to the Indian Ocean, and I think it's very interesting to look at it from the transformation of place. And when we look at the transformation of place, I think it has always been the site for important commerce, for important sort of transaction. We see a lot of choke points and very, very strategic choke points, oil routes. And more recently, we've seen the connectivity of submarine cables crisscrossing the Indian Ocean. And that's very interesting because it brings into the conversation mixed data. We have not yet talked about data, but I think it's also data is extremely important about the quality of resilience. And I know data can cut both ways. And we're talking a lot about data as being the new goal, isn't it? So how is data used upon, and how is it in the new resource that is sort of actioned upon? We'll come back to that later. But I think, zooming from the Western Indian Ocean islands, and I'm here talking about Mauritius, where I come from, but also Seychelles, Madagascar, Comoros, and so on and so forth. And what's interesting about the evolution of the Indian Ocean is that we have our traditional players. Many of those island states have colonial legacy, but more interestingly, in the last couple of decade and a half, or more specifically in the last 5 years, we've seen aggressive new players. And here, obviously, China through its BRI that we talked about earlier, but also India. And, in the discussion that we are talking about placemaking, we talk about the Indian Ocean as India's ocean, backwaters and front waters. And there's been a lot of conversation among scholars on the African continent. Why is it called the Indian Ocean? Why is it not called the Africa's ocean? But that's something else for the conversation. So as we sit in this, geopolitical, geostrategic sort of region, what's the role of island states, small island states? I see them as connecting dots. They are small, but yet they are also quite big in terms of their exclusive economic zone. Mauritius, for example, has an extensive economic zone, and I think in the earlier panel, earlier today, we talked about the blue economy. So I think it's interesting to go beyond this narrative of smallness and vulnerability and climate impact, and think about strategic partnership and strategic players. So how can you action upon the EEZ of those island states? Go beyond the narrative of smallness. I think, again, a lot of the conversation around action and solution is not to go solo, but to go in a very sort of collective sort of approach. But how do you bring together collectivism? Collectivism is about establishing a certain baseline where everybody agrees upon. But agreement is always very difficult, and I think, when we're talking about international norms and international laws, they are there, but very often they are there applied in its breach. So I think this idea of coming together through strength and through collectivism is extremely important. And as you said yourself, climate change is hitting small island states more than ever. The tapping and transforming your maritime footprint. We talk a lot about the blue economy, but how can the blue economy be transformed into a real full-fledged economy? How do you manage big players? I think, there is a lot of conversation that if we come together as small islands, we can actually face the big players in a sort of a collective demand, a collective expectation. But if you go solo, then it's a traditional sort of international relation, divide and rule approach. How do you move away from pawn to player? Here we obviously have a number of frameworks that exist in the Indian Ocean. We have the Indian Ocean Commission, and I think they've been doing a fabulous work around, maritime security, around the issue of overfishing and of terrorism. And I think there's been some interesting groundwork that has been done. We also are part of the Indian Ocean Rim Association. But again, the Indian Ocean Rim Association has a very it's a big club, but sometimes those big clubs do not always attend to the needs and the expectation of smaller islands. You've got SIDS as well. So I think how do you sort of use those very different platforms and networks to actually push a common agenda? And then I think, I don't want to bring it into an academic conversation, but sustainable development, it's a mouthful, and it's very, very difficult to sort of start to understand what is really sustainable development from different perspectives. Is there a common understanding? Is there a common framework? Is there a common route and pathway towards sustainable development, right? How do we see and how do we manage beyond national agenda? And how do we see that national agenda doesn't conflict with regional agenda, which doesn't conflict with, global agenda? So I think these are important understandings and discussion. But something that we've not heard enough about, we've heard a lot about government, we've heard a lot about private sector and business, but what about citizens' approach? And I think citizens are very, very important players in this configuration of a resilient and a sustainable development region. So I think one thing that we have to really bear in mind, what do we see the place making, and how do we contribute to fashioning, to shaping placemaking? And I think we should go beyond small, big dichotomy, powerful, vulnerable approaches, and sort of embrace the Indian Ocean, in a very sort of homogeneous manner, because it's only through that we can build sustainable partnership. And I think, ensuring that players and small and pawn makers actually come together. So I think the idea is to have a common voice, a common narrative, a common understanding, and bring people into the conversation, because people then are able to bring about policy change, because I think governments are transient, but its citizens remain in terms of their commitment. So I think it's an extremely, fascinating area, space that's going to evolve even more in the next 5 years, because the evolution sort of time space is changing. It's a continuum that is really changing, but it's both exciting for researchers like myself, for policymakers, for governments to actually establish this footprint for change for a sustainable, resilient, and proactive Indian Ocean where all the players have an equal standing. It might seem, wishful thinking, but I think it's only through that we can create sustainable change. But I'll just have the opening remarks, and I'm very happy to answer any further questions. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. Well, she dwelt on role of small islands, the choke points, the submarines crisscrossing, and what do we understand by sustainable development? Is there a common thread? How do we identify, the areas where we can all come together and find solutions that are sustainable for a longer time? Thank you so much. And we now come to Ambassador, the diplomat and foreign affairs secretary to Sri Lanka, former foreign secretary, Prasad Karyavasam. Sir, may I now invite you to make your observations?
Thank you. And when you are the last speaker, sometimes you wonder whether you're going to repeat what others have been saying. I think I'm not going to repeat, but I'll perhaps kind of collate stuff that you have heard. And I first want to express how happy I am to join this series of Indian Ocean conferences, which I have done quite a few. One of the best things that happened to our region in the recent years of international discourse, Indian Ocean Conference. I want to congratulate India Foundation for doing that. And I will be focusing more on sustainable development angle and how I think we could get there, especially from the Indian subcontinent point of view, from India-centric Indian subcontinent point of view, how we should get there. Of course, 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development adopted by the member states of the UN in 2015 provides a shared blueprint for peace and prosperity for the people of the world, the planet, the present, and to the future. 17 Sustainable Development Goals identified are to be achieved by 2030 to improve health, education, reduce inequality, spur economic growth while tackling climate change and working to preserve our oceans and forests. This is an excellent program of action that would ensure sustainable development worldwide if fully implemented. And it's a program of action to mobilize and unify all concerned local, national, regional, and global level. So it's a perfect blueprint. However, when one observes the progress made on each of the 17 goals agreed by the UN member states, it is obvious that the countries in the world, including those from our region, have been tardy and far behind the speed required to achieve the SDG targets by 2030. In fact, globally, only 15% of the targets are on track. 48% are moderately or severely off track. 37% are in stagnation or in regression. Perhaps this lack of progress on SDGs is the reason why we still discuss this subject at regional level and in forums like this. In the circumstances, it is obvious that the world and our region require not only redouble our efforts to achieve 17 agreed SDGs, but think anew, to new ideas, like that's been discussed today, to mobilize people to achieve sustainable development through alternative means. Let me present some views on this basis, taking into account renowned historical civilizational heritage of the Indian Ocean region. The region of the Indian Ocean, since time immemorial, has not existed as an isolated ocean. It has been an ocean connected with regions far beyond Indo-Pacific or Indo-Asia-Pacific on the eastern side, and Levant on the western side, among others. It has now come to light, following research, that the Indian subcontinent, during the Middle Ages, for nearly 1,000 years, enjoyed 35% of the world's GDP as compared to less than 5% today. So in Middle Ages, for 1,000 years, 35%. So it was a very vibrant region at that time. The relative prosperity of the Indian Ocean region in ancient times was a result of connections with the rest of the world through land and sea. There was no air connectivity at that time. Examination of how international trade relations and people-to-people contact were carried out during that era gives an idea as to what needs to be done by countries in the Indian Ocean now for engendering sustainable development in this modern era as well. In historic times, until the advent of colonial era, especially when the region was thriving as an economic powerhouse of the world for 1,000 years, no kingdom, entity or principality had hard borders between them. Borders were soft. Goods and services, people, including learned sages, crossed borders quite liberally, seeking ideas, opportunities for work, for trade, and pilgrimage. The region enjoyed relative prosperity in the world during that time. However, as a result of regional coming under colonial rule since 16th century onwards, in particular as a result of adopting Westphalian model of nation states, by 20th century, the borders became gradually harder. This affected freer trade and movement of people across borders. Without doubt, among other reasons, this hardening of borders too would have contributed to the rapid and relative decline of region's economy. Hence, it can be argued that if the region can get back to historical tradition of softer borders, where goods and services, skilled personnel can transit with ease, like in ancient times, when our region was prosperous, the potential exists to kickstart economic development that encompass every region in a sustainable manner across countries. Softer borders can create even more efficient supply chains, linking production, trade, and consumer transit centers. It allows countries to quickly and nimbly adjust to any ongoing change, maintaining national and regional competitive edge. And adding all this to the resulting ease of exchange of skills, raw materials, human resources can engender sustainable development across regions. Nevertheless, given the inequalities and asymmetries that exist within and across region, it goes without saying that special and differential treatment will still need to be employed to safeguard vulnerable communities and small economies. Such needs, although, and its attending regulation standards will of course fade away along with widespread prosperity in time to come. In this regard, I recognize softening borders must be underpinned by a robust security architecture that spans across Indo-Pacific, since soft borders and sustainable development can survive only in an atmosphere of sustained peace and stability across the region. For this purpose, countries in the region must endeavor to evolve a security architecture first among like-minded countries, with measures that can promote strategic harmony among key countries in the region. And such architecture must especially focus on sustaining expanding protection of sea-based links, in particular electronic links. I heard it was mentioned about the undersea cables. That's what I mean by electronic links across the region. This is critical in today's world to sustain supply chains and technological connectivity essential for human well-being and business. Without these two, we cannot sustain well-being and business. This can be complemented by a robust human security-based economic and social architecture that is open, transparent, and accountable, which can immensely contribute towards sustainable development. All these must have provisions that can subsequently expand and embraced by all countries that will agree with the basic principles of the system that promotes common prosperity. In addition, countries in the region can nurture centers of excellence and hubs of human activity like industrial and agriculture production, trade, transit centers like ports, both wet and dry ports, education and skill development, among other things. Such centers must not only connect the dots efficiently, but facilitate among them the exchange of human resources as liberally as possible. Such a system of centers and hubs that span across the region must not be exclusively single country enterprise, but multinational centers that can provide people in the region and beyond goods and services at a competitive cost in a sustainable manner, thus engendering sustainable development to the region and beyond. Creating soft borders and appropriate security architecture in the region must not be a subject to success of the other. It must be a simultaneous effort, feeding on the success of the other and taking into account local conditions and compulsions for exemptions. Exemptions are always required when you build an architecture of this nature, security or economic architecture. In our region, and in our region at present is in a strategic flux. These ideas may seem over the top, but I suggest that we look at EU, the region that gave rise to 2 world wars. The region is now well integrated, bringing human security and sustainable development to people living in the EU geographical space. In fact, as a result, there is a clamor among people living in vulnerable regions to enter EU space, even by illegal means. There is also examples of countries in the Indian Ocean region itself that have succeeded economically by gradually adopting soft borders. Singapore has done it very well. Though creating political, security, and trade architecture for achieving sustainable development is by and large a responsibility of experts and political leaders, to succeed sustainably, they require public acceptance. To engender sustainable development efforts, public trust is an essential condition. The voice of the people is paramount, since it's the ultimate key contributor towards sustainable development. And conference of this nature, which involves almost as many stakeholders as possible, provides opportunities to discuss issues frankly and thoughtfully to gain wider public acceptance. So I once again thank India Foundation for doing this, and looking forward for discussion. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I must thank the panelists for giving us the inputs into how do we build strategic partnerships as a way forward for Indian Ocean region. Thank the audience for their patience and for the discussion. Thank you.